All right, let us delve into the gilded and blood-soaked chambers of Rome, where beauty became a cage and power warped reality. The air of Rome, in the year 65 AD, still carried the acrid memory of smoke, a phantom limb of the great fire that had devoured swaths of the city the year prior. Whispers, like the scuttling rats in the rubble, spoke of arson, of an emperor watching from his golden house, perhaps fiddling a tune while his capital burned. Nero, Claudius, Caesar Augustus Germanicus, architect of grand visions and grander cruelties, sat at the apex of a world-straddling empire, his power absolute, his whims the only law that truly mattered within the marble confines of the Domus Aurea. This was not merely a palace. It was a universe sculpted by megalomania, vast halls dripping with gold leaf, ceilings that rotated like the heavens, gardens where exotic beasts roamed. Yet within this opulent cage, a different kind of darkness festered, born not of stone or gold, but of a soul twisting under the weight of its own unchecked power and a grief that was curdling into madness. Nero, barely into his late 20s, had already carved a path of theatrical excess, artistic pretensions, and a brutal disregard for anyone who crossed his path, especially those he claimed to love. Rome, jaded as it was by the caprices of emperors, watched, waited, and quietly despaired. And within this world, where the line between sovereign and monster blurred into an indistinguishable horror, lived a young man named Sporus. He was a freedman, technically free from the yoke of slavery, yet bound by an infinitely more terrifying chain, his proximity to the imperial sun, the blinding, destructive force of Nero himself. Sporus' story is etched in the annals not because he sought power or influence, but because he possessed a beauty so profound, so arresting, that it became his undoing. Accounts from the time, hushed and awestruck, describe him as having features of almost ethereal delicacy, a grace of movement that drew the eye. He was not robust, not built for the rigors of Roman life, but possessed a fragile, captivating beauty that seemed to exist outside the rough and tumble of the imperial court. It was this beauty, passive and unintentional, that caught the emperor's capricious, grief-addled gaze. The catalyst, as so often in tragedy, was death. Poppaea Sabina, Nero's second wife, the great, tumultuous love of his life, had died earlier that year in 65 AD. The circumstances were shrouded in conflicting accounts. Some whispered Nero had kicked her to death in a fit of savage rage, a blow to her pregnant belly. Others spoke of complications during childbirth. The truth, perhaps, was a blend of imperial brutality and unfortunate biology. Whatever the cause, her absence left Nero desolate, undone by a grief so consuming it warped his mind. He mourned her with extravagant public displays, commissioned statues, and spoke of her incessantly. But beneath the performance lay a raw, obsessive need to recapture what was lost, to deny the finality of death itself. It was in this fevered state of mourning that Nero saw Sporus. Perhaps in a corridor, perhaps attending to some minor duty within the vast palace machine. What Nero saw, or believed he saw, was not a young man, but a ghost. In Sporus's delicate features, in the shape of his eyes, the line of his jaw, the emperor saw a startling, almost unbearable resemblance to his dead Poppaea. The resemblance might have been faint, a trick of the light, or perhaps a projection of his own desperate psyche onto an innocent canvas. But to Nero it was undeniable. Suetonius and Cassius Dio, chroniclers of these dark times, recorded the emperor's sudden, intense fixation. Here, in this living vessel, was a chance, a grotesque possibility to bring back the woman he had lost, or perhaps the woman he had destroyed. The thought, once conceived in the emperor's turbulent mind, rapidly hardened into horrifying resolve. He would not just mourn Poppaea, he would recreate her, and Sporus, the beautiful, unwitting freedman, would be the clay. The decision was delivered not as a request, but as an imperial command, cold and absolute. Sporus would be surgically altered, castrated. The act itself was not merely physical mutilation, it was an annihilation of identity, a deliberate, brutal erasure of manhood. It happened within the sterile, opulent chambers of the palace's medical wing, where physicians, bound by oath and terror to the emperor's will, performed the unspeakable. The screams, if there were any, were muffled by thick marble walls, swallowed by the vast, indifferent architecture of power. Sporus's body, the very source of his unintended peril, was now irrevocably altered, reshaped to fit the contours of Nero's twisted desire. He was no longer Sporus, the freedman. He was raw material, stripped down, prepared for a horrifying transformation. The emperor's grief had not healed. It had mutated into a monstrous obsession, and Sporus was to be its living, breathing monument. The stage was set for a spectacle unlike any Rome had ever witnessed. A macabre performance where the lines between reality and madness dissolved completely, leaving only the tragic figure of a boy remade into a ghost's bride.
The immediate aftermath of the surgery was a haze of pain, confusion, and the chilling realization of irreversible transformation. Sporus, his young body brutalized and reshaped, found himself not cast out or discarded, but held closer, bound more tightly than ever to the source of his suffering. Nero's macabre plan unfolded with chilling precision. The emperor, having shattered Sporus's identity, now set about building a new one, or rather, resurrecting an old one through him. The command rippled through the imperial household. Sporus was to be treated as empress, not metaphorically, but literally. He was given a new name, Sabina, the name of the dead empress. He was dressed in the lavish, intricate gowns and tunics once worn by Poppaea, adorned with her jewels, heavy with the weight of a lost life and a terrifying inheritance. Courtiers, servants, and even the Praetorian Guard were instructed to address him with feminine titles, to accord him all the elaborate courtesies due an imperial wife. Sporus, the freedman, was dead. Long live Empress Sabina, the living echo. The climax of this grotesque charade was the public marriage ceremony. It was a spectacle designed to shock, yet also to assert Nero's twisted reality upon the Roman world. Performed with all the pomp and circumstance of a legitimate imperial wedding, the praenuba attending, the ritual vows, the feigned bashfulness of the bride, it was a chilling parody of Roman tradition. Sporus, draped in bridal finery that both masked and accentuated his altered form, was forced through the ancient rites. He walked the aisle not towards a life of shared companionship, but into a gilded cage of psychological and physical servitude. Nero, playing the role of the devoted bridegroom, beamed with a terrifying joy, seemingly genuinely convinced by the performance. The guests, the cream of Roman society, senators, generals, aristocrats, were compelled to attend, to offer congratulations, to present wedding gifts. They went through the motions, their faces fixed in expressions of forced celebration, while their minds reeled from the sheer horror of the scene. This was not merely eccentric, it was blasphemous, a fundamental violation of Roman law, custom, and perceived reality. The sight of their emperor marrying a castrated boy dressed as his dead wife was a stark, undeniable symbol of Nero's descent into pure, unchecked madness. Following the ceremony, the performance continued relentlessly. Sporus, now Empress Sabina, was paraded through Rome, required to attend public events, state dinners, and theatrical performances by Nero's side. He was displayed like a precious, morbid artifact, a living monument to Nero's loss and his power to defy death and reality itself. Imagine the psychological torment, being forced to wear the clothes, the name, the very identity of a woman, of the woman whose death the emperor mourned, and whom he might even have killed. Every public appearance, every required interaction was a fresh assault on the remnants of Sporus's own identity. He was a ghost, inhabiting another ghost, forced to perform a life that was not his, for a man who saw only a reflection of the dead. Inside the Domus Aurea, the reality was perhaps even more claustrophobic. Sporus lived under Nero's constant, possessive gaze. He was treated with a terrifying mixture of affection and objectification. Nero would address him as Poppaea, speak to him as if he were the dead empress, recounting memories they supposedly shared, expecting Sporus to respond in character. It was a form of psychological torture, a demand not just to play a role, but to become that role, to surrender his own self entirely. Gifts were lavished upon him: jewels, silks, slaves, the trappings of an empress, while the fundamental dignity of a human being was denied. The relationship, if it could be called that, was defined by Sporus's utter powerlessness. He was beautiful, yes, but his beauty had become a brand, marking him as the emperor's property. He had no voice, no agency, no escape. He was a living canvas upon which Nero painted his grief and his delusion. The servants and courtiers navigated this bizarre world with nervous caution, addressing Sporus with the required feminine titles, observing the protocols, all the while knowing the tragic, horrifying truth. Some might have felt pity, others revulsion, but all were complicit, forced to participate in the elaborate lie that now formed the foundation of Nero's public and private life. The constant strain, the perpetual performance, the enforced femininity that went beyond clothing and name, demanding even posture, gesture, and tone of voice. All of this took a visible toll. Sporus, once the beautiful freedman, became increasingly withdrawn, his delicate features perhaps etched with a permanent melancholy. He was a captive in a gilded cage, a trophy wife forged in cruelty, trapped in a reality defined by the twisted desires of the man who held absolute power over his life, body, and soul. He was Empress Sabina, the Empress of Shadows, a chilling symbol of imperial might turned inward, consuming the innocent in its path.
The years that followed Nero's grotesque marriage to Sporus were a period of suspended horror, a macabre tableau frozen in time. Sporus continued to exist as Empress Sabina, a silent, melancholy figure moving through the opulent halls of the Domus Aurea and the public spaces of Rome at Nero's side. The forced identity, the constant performance, the weight of the dead empress's name and clothing, all pressed down upon him, slowly, inexorably, crushing the remnants of who he once was. Nero, meanwhile, continued his reign of excess and terror. He embarked on theatrical tours of Greece, compelled to perform before adoring or terrified audiences, dragging Sporus along. Imagine the journey: crossing the sea, arriving in foreign lands where Roman power was absolute, yet the local customs might have offered a brief, tantalizing glimpse of a different world, only to find himself still trapped, still forced to maintain the facade of femininity, still introduced to Greek dignitaries and aristocrats as Nero's empress. Suetonius records these travels, highlighting the emperor's insistence on displaying his wife to the world, a testament to his pride in his monstrous creation. These travels, far from being a respite, must have amplified the psychological strain. Surrounded by strangers, forced into unfamiliar social rituals while maintaining a perfect false persona, Sporus was utterly exposed, utterly alone in his performance. The gilded chains stretched across the empire, binding him wherever Nero went. There was never a moment to drop the mask, to breathe, to simply be. His existence was a continuous, exhausting act of self-erasure, a prison of identity from which there was no parole. Nero, meanwhile, continued his reign of excess and terror. He embarked on theatrical tours of Greece, compelled to perform before adoring or terrified audiences, dragging Sporus along. Imagine the journey: crossing the sea, arriving in foreign lands where Roman power was absolute, yet the local customs might have offered a brief, tantalizing glimpse of a different world, only to find himself still trapped, still forced to maintain the facade of femininity, still introduced to Greek dignitaries and aristocrats as Nero's empress. Suetonius records these travels, highlighting the emperor's insistence on displaying his wife to the world, a testament to his pride in his monstrous creation. These travels, far from being a respite, must have amplified the psychological strain. Surrounded by strangers, forced into unfamiliar social rituals while maintaining a perfect false persona, Sporus was utterly exposed, utterly alone in his performance. The gilded chains stretched across the empire, binding him wherever Nero went. There was never a moment to drop the mask, to breathe, to simply be. His existence was a continuous, exhausting act of self-erasure, a prison of identity from which there was no parole. Nero's treatment of Sporus swung violently between possessive affection and terrifying rage. He would shower Sporus with gifts, treat him with the doting tenderness he had once shown Poppaea, perhaps genuinely convincing himself, in moments of delusion, that she had been restored to him. But any perceived failure to perfectly embody the dead empress, a wrong look, a hesitant word, a moment where Sporus's true self might have surfaced, could trigger a furious outburst. The emperor, capable of kicking his pregnant wife to death, was certainly capable of brutalizing her living replacement. This cycle of abuse and temporary reprieve, of being simultaneously cherished and brutalized for not being someone else, was a psychological torment designed to break the spirit. Within the imperial household, the bizarre arrangement became the norm, albeit a chilling one. Servants grew accustomed to addressing the young man in dresses as empress, to witnessing the strange, strained dynamic between him and the emperor. Pity might have flickered in some eyes, disgust in others, but silence and complicity were the only safe responses. Everyone was forced into playing a role in Nero's private theater of madness, with Sporus trapped center stage. The physical reality of his castration, the permanent alteration of his body, was a constant, silent companion to the psychological ordeal. It was a physical manifestation of the violence done to his identity, a scar that went deeper than skin. While Nero indulged in his theatrical pursuits and his private perversions, the political ground beneath him was crumbling. His neglect of administration, his punitive taxes, his perceived cowardice after the fire, and his increasingly erratic behavior had alienated the Roman elite and stirred discontent in the provinces. The sight of the emperor parading a castrated boy dressed as a woman became a potent symbol of his degeneracy, a sign that he was unfit to rule. The Senate seethed in private, governors plotted from afar. By 68 AD, the storm finally broke. Rebellions flared in Gaul and Spain. The Praetorian Guard in Rome, sensing the inevitable shift in power, declared their opposition to Nero. The Senate followed suit, declaring him a public enemy. Faced with capture and a humiliating death, Nero fled Rome in the dead of night, accompanied by a small, desperate retinue. Among them was Sporus, still in his feminine attire, still bound to the falling tyrant. The young man who had been given no choice in his fate, who had been brutally remade to serve one man's obsession, now found his survival inextricably linked to that man's desperate flight. The final days were a chaotic blur of fear and uncertainty. Nero, alternating between despair and delusional plans for escape or a dramatic suicide, dragged his diminished court through the Roman countryside. Sporus, the silent empress, remained by his side, a poignant, tragic figure in the crumbling tableau of Nero's reign. He must have known that the end of his tormentor might not bring freedom, but simply a new form of captivity. When Nero finally took his own life in June 68 AD, reportedly with the assistance of his secretary Epaphroditus, it was not the end of Sporus's nightmare, but merely a transition. He was left, a living relic of a monstrous reign, a prize, a curiosity, a symbol. The year that followed, the infamous Year of 4 Emperors, would prove that for Sporus, freedom was a luxury he might never know. His fate was now in the hands of whichever warlord or politician managed to seize the purple, each with their own plans for the boy who had been Nero's bride. With Nero's death, the delicate, horrifying ecosystem that had defined Sporus's existence evaporated, but the cage remained. He was not liberated, he was simply inherited. Galba, the first of the emperors who would briefly wear the purple in the tumultuous year of 69 AD, took possession of Sporus. He was treated not as a person, but as a piece of Nero's legacy, a curious artifact from a reign now deemed degenerate. Under Galba, Sporus continued to exist in a state of limbo, required to maintain aspects of his feminine presentation, a living reminder of his previous master's madness, but no longer accorded the bizarre status of empress. It was a liminal existence, neither male nor female, neither free nor enslaved, perpetually on display, yet utterly disregarded, a psychological purgatory for a soul already ravaged by years of enforced identity erasure. This period, known as the Year of the Four Emperors, saw Rome plunged into civil war and rapid brutal transfers of power. Galba's reign lasted only a few months before he was assassinated. Sporus was passed, like valuable furniture or a captured banner, to the next claimant to the throne. He was a symbol of conquest, a trophy that signaled continuity of power, even if that power was fleeting and unstable. Each transition brought new uncertainty, new masters with different appetites and whims, each stripping away another layer of dignity. Otho, who briefly seized power after Galba, reportedly treated Sporus with a degree of kindness, perhaps recognizing in the young man's precarious situation a mirror of his own unstable grip on authority. But Otho's reign, too, was short-lived. Defeated by Vitellius, he committed suicide, and Sporus was once again transferred to new ownership, another soul tossed on the violent tides of imperial ambition. It was under Vitellius, the third emperor of that brutal year, that Sporus's fate reached its final, most degrading chapter. Vitellius, a man known for his gluttony and vulgarity, saw not a person in Sporus, but a potential source of entertainment for the jaded Roman mob. His plan, perhaps the most horrific cruelty inflicted upon Sporus, was conceived for the arena, not as a gladiator, not even as a simple spectacle, but as the victim in a grotesque live reenactment of a mythological scene, the rape of Proserpina. Sporus, already forced to embody a woman, already physically altered, was to be forced into the ultimate humiliation, publicly violated, playing the role of a maiden abducted and sexually assaulted for the amusement of thousands of spectators in the arena. It was the final crushing blow, a degradation so profound it went beyond physical or psychological torment, seeking to strip him of every last vestige of humanity. The arena, the symbol of Roman spectacle and cruelty, was to be the stage for his final, unwilling performance. For years, Sporus had endured. He had suffered castration, forced feminization, psychological torture, public humiliation, and the constant dread of living at the mercy of unstable, absolute power. He had worn the dresses, adopted the name, played the part. He had survived Nero, the fall of an empire, and the chaotic succession of emperors. But the prospect of this ultimate public violation was a bridge too far. It was the breaking point. The ancient sources record Sporus's final act with a chilling brevity. Faced with this final, unspeakable degradation planned by Vitellius, Sporus chose death. He took his own life before the emperor could carry out his cruel plan. In that moment, in that ultimate act of despair and refusal, Sporus reclaimed the one thing that had been systematically denied him for years: his agency, his will, the power to make a choice about his own fate. Sporus's suicide was not a grand public event. It was not marked by official mourning. To Vitellius and the Roman court, it was likely just an inconvenience, the cancellation of a planned performance. He had been so dehumanized, reduced to a mere object of perverse entertainment, that his passing was barely registered as a loss. Yet in choosing death over absolute degradation, Sporus performed a final quiet act of defiance.
He refused to be utterly broken, utterly defiled for the amusement of others. His story is a horrifying testament to the depths of human cruelty, enabled by unchecked power, to the ability of tyranny to warp not just lives, but identity itself. He was a victim of a system that saw human beings as tools, toys, or symbols for the powerful. But his final choice, tragic as it was an assertion of his fundamental humanity, a refusal to allow his tormentors the final victory of complete annihilation. In the blood-soaked tapestry of Roman history, Sporus remains a haunting, indelible figure, a reminder of the innocent lives crushed beneath the weight of imperial whim.